Welcome everyone to this late breaking session of the American Society of International Law's annual conference entitled Democracy Under Threat. My name is Sean Murphy. I'm the Manat An Professor of International Law at George Washington University. I'm also a member of the UN International Law Commission. And of particular note for this conference, I'm the immediate past president of the American Society of International Law. It's a great pleasure to have with me today for a conversation Professor Rosa Brooks of Georgetown University Law Center. And let me introduce her to you, although I imagine many of you already are quite familiar with her. But Rosa received her Bachelor of Arts degree from Harvard University in History and Literature, and she followed that with a master's degree from Oxford University in Social Anthropology. But I guess she found her true love when she went to Yale Law School, where she graduated and then proceeded on various paths, but ended up as a professor of law at the University of Virginia, and then jumped in 2007 to Georgetown University Law Center, where she is today the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law and Policy. Rosa Brooks has combined a wealth of experience, her teaching, her scholarship, but also in practice. And in that regard, of relevance to the conversation today, she has had stints in the US government, serving there as the counselor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Michelle Flournoy, from 2009 to 2011. And while there, founded the Defense Department's Office for Rule of Law and International Humanitarian Policy, for which she received the Secretary of Defense's Medal for Outstanding Public Service. She's a prolific writer. Many of you have probably seen articles, not just in Law Reviews, but also in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal. Her books have been extraordinary, and I'll mention a couple of them. One that received a lot of attention in 2016 was her book, How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything. But of particular interest, perhaps for this conversation, I note that Rosa Brooks has been active in issues that concern policing. She founded at Georgetown Law Center a program on innovative policing, and she herself is a reserve officer in the DC Metropolitan Police Department, which no doubt provided fodder for her latest book, Tangled Up in Blue: Policing the Nation's Capital, which just came out this year. Rosa, it's a great pleasure to have you here today. I hope you're staying relatively safe and sane amidst this year of pandemic.
Sean, thank you so much, and it's great to be here. I should say I'm a former DC Reserve Police officer, and yes, the experiences I had as a DC Reserve Police officer, which were exactly as fascinating and weird as you would expect, are the subject of that book, Tangled Up in Blue. But I stepped down from that because the book was coming out. But I'm glad to be here.
Well, wonderful to have you. And can I just ask, is Georgetown likely to be back in full in-person teaching in the fall at this point? What do you think?
I hope so, but who knows? You know, I think like everybody else, we're making 800 different contingency plans.
Yeah, I would give the same answer for GW Law School. One hopes and expects. The trend lines seem to be relatively good, but even in the past day or two, a lot more questions being raised about the outbreaks in certain parts of the country. So I guess we'll...
Although I don't know if this is good news or bad news, but as we've discovered in the last year, as law professors, it turns out that our physical presence is almost entirely irrelevant to our students.
Yes, dirty little secret that's now out.
They don't need us at all.
Well, let's turn to the more serious, perhaps, issue of the day, democracy under threat. And I do note to the listeners who are out there that they can submit questions to us over the course of this hour using the Q&A tab on your screen. But Rosa, I want to start with this a very interesting project that you did last year. You ran a series of political scenario exercises last June with a bipartisan group of experts, which essentially gamed out what might happen if a loser of the 2020 presidential election refused to concede. And you know, today this may sound, sure, that makes sense. Back then, it's kind of prescient of you to do this. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about this. I know it was called the Transition Integrity Project, and it was well publicized at the time, but I'm imagining that many now may have not fully remembered what it was. So could you describe that project a little bit? What were the scenarios? How did you construct them? Who was involved in it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll start with the origin of this project, which was in the fall of 2019. I was actually at a dinner in DC back when we still had dinners. And it was one of those, you know, big banquets where everybody has name tags. And I was sitting at a table between a federal appellate court judge and you know, a bunch of corporate law firm people and academics, and we were just chatting. And I said, you know, as one did, I said, wow, you know, we're talking about Donald Trump, and I said, you know, what if Trump loses the election and he won't leave? And everybody laughed at the table. This, again, fall of 2019. And the judge said, oh, that would never happen. The military would never let that happen. And then somebody else said, oh, that would never happen. The Secret Service would never let that happen. And the conversation moved on. But I was thinking, wait a second, you know, hold on. What, the military would never let that happen? What do we mean by that? What does that mean? You know, are you picturing the Joint Chiefs marching across the Potomac with bazookas and dragging Trump out of the White House or something? Number one, that's crazy. That's not how it works. That's not how the chain of command works. That's not how anything works. Number two, if we end up needing the US military to save democracy, then we're in really deep trouble, right? And the Secret Service, the same set of questions about, you know, some assumptions about how institutions work, embedded in this idea that there's this automatic thing that would happen. And I actually, people very often used and still use this idea of the so-called guardrails of democracy, as if we're all on an amusement park ride. And whenever we get to a dangerous moment, don't worry, these guardrails will just kind of automatically pop up to keep us on track. And it's always seemed to me, and this is something I've written about in different ways throughout my career, the guardrails are us. You know, there is no separate, there's nothing automatic about it. You know, those guardrails exist if and when we make them exist and invest in making them exist, and it's hard work. And that just led me to really start thinking about what would happen. You know, what would happen if, as it turned out, did happen, President Trump were to say, I don't accept the results of the election. It's a lie. It's fake. I really won. What would happen? What would different institutional actors do? And it seemed to me, particularly having spent some time at the Pentagon, where gaming exercises and simulation exercises are very, very much part of how people try to test their own assumptions, that it would be a perfect set of questions to subject to that kind of analysis. And I should emphasize by saying that, as you know, but I think not everybody realizes, that kind of wargaming does not predict the future. What it does is it tests people's assumptions. You know, it's a way to say, okay, you know, US military, you assume that we would prevail in a war against China or whatever it might be, whatever, pick your own hypothesis, Iran, whatever. Let's test that. So let's say they did this, and then you do that, and then what happens? And maybe it turns out that our assumptions are wrong, that things don't work the way we think they will. So I raised this idea to my friend Nils Gilman, a historian who's now at the Berggruen Institute in California, and he liked the idea. And we didn't have any money for it, but we thought we could do it really without any money, or, you know, not much. And the pandemic, and just in fact our friend in that regard, because instead of having to fly people anywhere, we were all on Zoom. And we thought, let's bring together some people to test a bunch of scenarios. We selected 4 scenarios to start with. just the ones that we and the people we consulted thought were most plausible. One was a Trump win, genuine Trump win, winning the Electoral College. We assumed he would probably not win the popular vote, but a decisive Electoral College win. Another was a decisive Biden win, which indeed is more or less what we ended up getting. A third was a very narrow Biden win, a win, but a squeaker. And then the fourth was a period, much like the election of 2000, of just extended indeterminacy, where it was not clear at all who had legitimately won according to the rules. And we put together a group of people. We thought it would be pretty useless for me to hypothesize about what the Trump campaign would do or the Biden campaign, because I don't know. I've never worked in a presidential campaign. And I assume we have an echo. I don't know if our listeners hear that too. Okay, it's gone. Excellent. And we wanted to get people who had worked on Republican presidential campaigns at senior levels, who had worked on Democratic presidential campaigns at senior levels, people who were either former members of Congress or senior staffers for members of Congress, people who are journalists and so forth. Because as much as possible, we wanted a group of people who wouldn't just be making things up, but who would be able to speak from some experience about having worked in those capacities. If such and such happened, here's what I think those actors would do. We divided our folks into teams. We had a Trump campaign team, a Biden campaign team, a Democratic elected officials team, a GOP elected officials team. We had a career civil servants team. We had a media team. And so on. And we did 4 exercises. We essentially gave them these starting scenarios. You know, it's 3 a.m. election night or early hours of the next day. Here is where things stand right now. Go. What do you do now? What do the other actors do in response? And that's how we did it. And I'll pause right there. To leave everybody in suspense about what happened.
Well, let's not leave them too much in suspense. I remember reading about the outcomes when it emerged. I think various media covered it. I think you were interviewed maybe by Ari Shapiro on NPR. But remind me, what were the basic outcomes that these various scenarios revealed?
So the outcomes were not great. I mean, in keeping, I'm always like the most paranoid person in any given room. So they weren't that surprising to me, because I always think the apocalypse is coming. But the outcomes were not terribly reassuring. No guardrails automatically popped up. And what we saw was that in every scenario, really, except for the big Biden win scenario, major problems occurred. Both sides, there were challenges to the results from the losing side. Both sides sought to mobilize social media and supporters to their advantage. The Trump side was consistently somewhat more ruthless and effective in doing that than the Biden side in our exercise. And obviously this was, not people who were affiliated with those campaigns, just people playing those roles. And we assumed our players, the way the gameplay worked. The Trump team, in all of the scenarios except for the Trump victory, sought to persuade state level voting officials to re-examine, to do recounts. They sought to persuade state legislatures to create alternate slate of electors to go to the Electoral College in states where they appeared to have lost. We saw street level political violence in virtually all of our scenarios. And it was pretty scary. In the big Biden win scenario, eventually we got to inauguration. Trump then went off to start, I think, Trump TV or something like that in our scenario. And I think what it really highlighted, I think it was actually quite shocking for many of our participants themselves, and several of our participants wrote about it themselves or talked about it in the media, because I think even people who really were pretty cynical, political strategists and consultants, were a little shocked that those guardrails weren't there. And were a little bit shocked at how quickly in our scenarios things went really, really wrong. Things went really, really badly.
And just to clarify, so one of the scenarios was a Trump win, but Biden would contest it. Is that correct? And this too led to the conflagration you're talking about. I just want to be sure that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for anyone who's listening, who's interested, you can find the full report on these exercises on our website. And I actually can't remember our website, but if you Google Transition Integrity Projects, one of the first things that pops up should be our website, where you can see both an FAQ about the project and a link to the full report, which we put out in August of 2020. In the Trump win scenario, first of all, Trump was not happy with these electoral college win and popular vote loss, and even in his victory, the players playing Trump sought to claim that any votes for Biden were fraudulent, and that in fact he had won the popular vote and so forth. In that particular scenario, we posited a Biden popular vote victory very similar to what, in fact, Biden obtained, e.g., about 7 million or so, significantly higher than Hillary Clinton's popular vote victory over Trump in 2016. And we did see, we saw a great deal of anger on the Biden side, a sense that this is a system that is really rigged against the Democratic Party at this point. And efforts to challenge the victory. There were some sort of unsuccessful efforts made by some of the players to challenge electoral slates at the state level, as Trump himself did. There was even the media made a whole lot of this, but it wasn't quite as dramatic as the media suggested. There was even a brief ploy on the part of some of the players on the Democratic side to use threats to urge secession by California and other states as a bargaining chip to get Republicans to agree to some electoral reforms. It got billed in the media as, and then the Democrats, threatened to secede and have a civil war. Well, definitely wasn't that. It was a sort of, maybe we could suggest that we might go nuclear in order to get these reforms, but it never actually got there. But even that was kind of shocking. And I, but I think actually spoke to the deep sense that exists on the Democratic side, as well as on the right, that the system is broken and that many people do not have confidence in the ability of the system to produce a fair result. Now, needless to say, I personally think that one side has a point and the other side doesn't. But certainly that feeling is very widely shared, I think, on both sides of the political spectrum.
So we might move from the scenario world into the world of real life, because we did have a transition integrity catastrophe in the form of the violent storming of the Capitol on January 6th, the very day that the electoral votes were to be counted that would formalize Joe Biden's victory as president. Do you think that the January 6th attack demonstrated the vulnerability of U.S. democratic institutions?
Absolutely, and it could have been so much worse. I do think, and I should emphasize, our project was not the only project that tried to think hard about things that could go wrong in different ways. And one of the things that I think that our project helped spearhead, although again, lots of other people were also doing this, was a real effort beginning in the spring of 2019 to say, whoa, let's not be so confident that everything will go right. And it's a tricky tightrope to walk, right? Because people didn't want to inadvertently further undermine Americans' faith in the electoral process. And yet at the same time, we did want to prepare for the worst. And there was a lot of effort, both in the media and more quieter, meetings and so on, to talk to different actors, including state level election officials, to say, here are some things that we think could happen. You need to be ready. You need to know the law. You need to know what powers you have. You need to know what powers you don't have. You need to know what powers the legislature has, what powers election officials have. Hey, judges, You need to expect challenges that raise this, and that, and you really don't want to be faced with an emergency hearing and reading the relevant law for the first time that day, learn it now. And I think that those efforts, which involve thousands and thousands of people, both at the national and the state level from many organizations, did pay off, and helped keep things from being even worse than they were. That said, the fact that even with all of that preparation, we had a near catastrophe. And our project and many others warned about political violence, and the prospects of political violence, and the importance of tracking, in particular, violent extremist far right and white nationalist groups. And yet, on January 6th, we were this close to catastrophe. It was in some sense pure dumb luck that things were not 1,000 times worse. If the reinforcements that did arrive had arrived half an hour later, etc. If the Capitol Police had been 20 minutes slower in evacuating members of Congress and the vice president. So it was, I don't think any of us should feel like, oh, hooray, democracy has been vindicated, democracy has triumphed, and now we can relax. I think it showed not only the vulnerability of our systems at the time, but frankly, our ongoing vulnerability.
I'm curious about your thoughts on how social media plays into all of this. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, these are wonderful new technologies, but it does feel like they're part of the problem here, and that the reason why we're seeing this happening now and didn't see it 20 years ago or 30 years ago has something to do with this ability to channel hatred, to make false narratives, to deny facts and so on. What do you think about that?
I think it's a really interesting question. So on the one hand, clearly social media, our echo's back. Social media has accelerated everything. It means that you can spread misinformation much faster, overnight, in a way that just wasn't possible using earlier technologies. I don't want to say misinformation propaganda campaigns are new. Clearly they're not. And clearly when we look at prior incidents of society slipping into civil conflict, when we look at genocides and other mass atrocities, we see bad actors manipulating radio, manipulating newspaper, manipulating all sorts of communication technologies to spread false information and to stir up rage and stir up sort of tribal emotions, and incite violence. I mean, in the Rwandan genocide, radio was an enormous factor. In the Holocaust, newspapers, other publications, and mass rallies and speeches were an enormous factor. So there's nothing new about the use of misinformation and lies to foment political violence. What I think, and I'm so far from being a social media expert, as my children remind me on a daily basis. But what clearly is different is the speed, and the lack of clearly established norms about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. Twitter, as we know, ultimately said, okay, no more President Trump, you're blocked, we're done. But it took a really long time, right? And was that appropriate? Was that not appropriate? Should it have been done 6 months earlier? And I, when I was working at the Defense Department, a small piece of my portfolio was thinking about information operations and how do we define them and should we do them? Are we any good at them? But it always did strike me, I mean, even as early as 2018, 2019, that we should, going back to the 2016 election and foreign interference in the 2016 election, that we really needed in some ways to analyze what was happening in this country as information warfare. And in a sense, it's almost irrelevant how much of it was sparked by foreign actors, the Russians, whoever, versus how much was domestic. Because once it's out there, it's out there. And it may have started with one actor, but then it becomes a domestic problem. And we have to use some of the tools for thinking about information warfare to understand what's going on. And I think we were very, very, very slow to do that.
While we're talking about the sort of non-state elements and actors, I noticed that Kate Jastrom has asked a question about the role of corporations in all of this. And it's a very interesting question because, we did see after January 6th, a number of corporations saying we're not going to contribute to the electoral campaigns of some of the folks who were trying to, in essence, derail the counting of the Electoral College. But what about even before that, right? Could more have been done by corporate actors, say Coca-Cola in Georgia, to sort of help buttress, the strength of the democracy?
It's a great question. The answer is surely yes. That said, I suppose there's a little bit of a be careful what we wish for element to this. In a sense, corporations that rely on, heavily on the average American or broad spectrum Americans as consumers are more likely to be responsive to majority sentiment, and majority sentiment, I don't think favors the far right narrative. I think that's a minority sentiment politically, but not all corporations are particularly responsive to a sort of cross section of American society and have the resources to intervene in potentially really problematic ways. And there too, I think it's a terrific question, and I don't think we have a particularly good theoretical framework or legal framework for thinking about how we should feel about that, and whether, when, and how we should try to regulate the role of corporate actors. And this is not, obviously, this is related to the issue of campaign funding, but it's separate. A lot of this was after the campaigns were over. I don't know how to answer. It's a great question, though.
In terms of the January 6th attack, you said it could have been a lot worse on that day in that place and whatnot. And I'm wondering if you could say something more about the guardrails that did come into play in the lead up to that particular day. I'm particularly thinking about the role of courts in rejecting pretty much systematically every attempt to turn aside the election results. Is there a silver lining here to take out of the lead up to January 6th that we should feel somewhat good about, or is this really a catastrophe waiting to happen?
I mean, I think this is a glass half full, glass half empty situation. I don't think it just happened to happen that courts responded the way they did. I don't think it just happened to happen that that leaders in the U.S. military, all the service chiefs at various points, made very clear statements. The military does not have any role in electoral politics. No, don't try to drag us in. No, etc. I think that those things happened again because of the many, many, many thousands of people and organizations who worked really hard in the run up to the election to reach out to those actors and say, here are the threats, be ready. It's really important that you be those guardrails. So in that sense, I think, there was a lot of success I think none of us, the thing about institutions, of course, is that they're made up of humans. There's no such thing as an institution that just exists independent of the people who work in it. And we humans, all of us, we're not so great at responding on the fly to challenges that we're not expecting. We're much better if we have thought about it in advance and, okay, if this happens, here's what I'm going to do. If that happens, here's what I'm going to do. So I think that it really sort of reinforced for me that sense of, if you want guardrails, build the guardrails, and building the guardrails means reminding people that they are the guardrails. And that's important, and it works. So in that sense, the glass is very much half full. It's half empty in that, despite that, we failed in certain key respects. And when I say we, I mean all those committed to the guardrails of democracy and being those guardrails. We, to this day, have a population that is both tremendously polarized and which some substantial percentage of the US population believes that President Trump won the election, that the Biden victory was a lie, and some non-trivial percentage of that group, and it's actually quite hard, I think, to know what the percentage is. You know, maybe it's 40% who believe that Biden's victory was a lie, despite all those courts, despite all those actors saying it's legitimate. Some unknown percentage of that 40% not only thinks it's a lie, but is prepared to use violence to try to achieve their objectives. And that represents a massive failure, and a massive failure that is a collective failure.
Let's broaden the aperture a little bit here and move past, January 6th and the issue of a presidential election and a challenge or refusal to concede defeat. There seem to be other big issues that strike at the heart of American democracy. I'm thinking about voter suppression initiatives that are underway in a number of states these days. I'm thinking about more structural issues, Electoral College and the peculiarities of it, the entrenchment of minority power in the Senate, the gerrymandering of districts that seem to have significantly polarized the House of Representatives. Do you see these bigger structural issues as also a part of the threat to American democracy?
Very much, and this is the American Society of International Law, and most of our audience spends a lot of time thinking not about the U.S. as an exceptional nation, but the U.S. as one nation amongst many. And I do think that if I were looking at the United States from the outside, I don't know that I would call us a democracy at this point. I think that the sort of structural democratic deficits within our own system, as you just ran through a number of them, are so great that it's not clear that we can in any meaningful sense be called a democracy. And if we, the United States, if our State Department was without our own history and past, was looking at similar patterns and systems in another country, we would say, oh boy, you guys are in big trouble. Your democracy is failing. You needed to do a lot of work. So yeah.
So would you support then, various ideas that are thrown out there, moving away from having an electoral college, ending the filibuster in the Senate, maybe having the courts be more active in redistricting, state level redistricting plans so that, we don't get the kind of gerrymandering that's going on?
I absolutely would. How realistic that is, I don't know. Obviously, our courts have had a very large percentage of federal judges who now sitting have been appointed by Republican administrations. I'm really so relieved that so many of those Republican appointed judges nonetheless stuck to their role as guardrails during this election. But I think when it comes to future redistricting and gerrymandering issues, it's less clear what will happen. I think that the very democratic deficits that have given rise in part to the current crisis will make it extraordinarily difficult to make changes that favor greater democracy, getting rid of the Electoral College and so forth. So I'm not terribly optimistic. I should say, yeah, I am still really, really worried about where this country goes in the future. I do not think any of us should say, oh, dodge that bullet, we're fine now. We can all relax. I think that yes, I'm incredibly relieved that things did not go worse, that we did in the end have a peaceful transition of power on Inauguration Day and so on. And but I don't feel at all sanguine about the future.
Yeah, I can sympathize with that skepticism or uncertainty, and I think a lot of people feel that. It will be interesting to see in the next few years whether something like the filibuster does go by the wayside, at least on some issues, maybe on the issue of, electoral integrity issues. Maybe it could be set aside. And there's an interesting initiative among a number of states, you've probably heard about it, a compact where they would all agree to provide their electoral votes for the majority.
A few more states to join.
Yeah, a few more states to make that happen. So maybe there's some bright possibilities out there, and I think that people like you and others are going to be thinking hard about that. You did note, Rosa, this is the American Society of International Law, so we do tend to have a bit of a transnational perspective, and maybe we could shift in that direction. You almost have already answered this question, but I guess I'll put it to you again. Is it the case that you think other countries, particularly now after January 6th, are looking at the United States in a very different way? I'm thinking, democracies that are out there and maybe have been modeling themselves after the US, the oldest democracy. Maybe they're not so sure about that anymore. What do you think?
Yeah, and Sean, I would actually love to hear your thoughts on this as well, because in your capacity as April president, I'm sure that you've had a lot of conversations with friends from other countries who think hard about these issues. My own sense, and after our Transition Integrity Project report came out in the late autumn, the winter, I had a lot of conversations with folks at various embassies in Washington who were sort of saying, what's happening? What's going to happen? What should we do? What do we do before and after the election? And my sense, even before January 6th, was that many of our closest US allies and partners were looking at us in shock and dismay, and essentially saying, we sort of know what to do in Belarus or or Kenya if there is an electoral fairness issue, if there's an issue relating to the integrity of democracy, but this is the United States. What do we do? And my answer to them at the time and still was, you need to treat us the exact same way you treat Belarus, or the exact same way that you treat Kenya, which is to say, we need our friends to hold us to account, because that matters. And I don't mean it just matters rhetorically, but even Republicans, perhaps not President Trump, but Republican members of Congress are sensitive to the fact that we are enmeshed in a global economy. We are enmeshed in a network of global security relationships. And if our closest allies and partners say, we are turning your backs on you, we don't want to be part of this effort or that effort with you, we don't want to share intelligence with you, we don't want to do, that is going to have an impact. Again, not necessarily, Donald Trump, I think, was relatively immune to those kinds of concerns. But I think that the Mitch McConnells of the world are not. That it does matter, and people get it, that we can't simply afford to say, who cares what the rest of the world thinks of us. It will hit us where it hurts, which is the national wallet and national security.
Yeah, I think
I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, well, just on that last bit, a good example would be the override of President Trump's veto with respect to the Department of Defense bill, where it was sort of this issue of the renaming of military bases was something that had upset the Trump administration. And I think the Senate, and which was Republican majority at the time, said, well, we've got some more important issues here that we need to be sure we fund our Defense Department and so on. No, I received some of the same messages that you did in the aftermath of, well, on the day of January 6th and in its aftermath, shock, even fear. What does this mean? What's happening? How could this happen? You know, you occasionally see in a parliament or a Duma or something, you know, a conflagration of some sort, but to see people sitting in a speaker's chair or in an office, you know, feet up on the table, you know, wearing, you know, sometimes Confederate flags and things like this. It's just, it's not just a comment on, you know, American democracy and peaceful transition and our ability, despite great differences, to get along, but it's a comment on us not being a predictable ally for our friends abroad, I think, because, you know, ever since the Second World War, it's been deeply entrenched that the United States, it's got flaws, it's got problems, sometimes it makes mistakes. We've got Vietnam here, we've got, you know, that there. But by and large, it's there when you need it. It's a strong economic, military, and political power. And to see what happened on January 6th, I think just, you know, to some extent, did very much blow away the minds of many of our friends abroad. Let's think instead about countries that aren't necessarily friends of the US. Let's think about the more authoritarian regimes out there. It seems as though they often follow the same kinds of tactics that we've seen in the United States over the past few years, you know, the sort of denying of facts and demonizing of opposition, calling elections rigged, calling the press enemies of the people. I mean, this sounds like Stalin to me, and I tend to think maybe this fortifies the views of some of those leaders abroad. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely think that we have historically, the US has prided itself, probably falsely at times, but nonetheless, part of our national mythology is, you know, we're a city upon a hill. We are a shining beacon of freedom to the rest of the world, and so on. And there's been some truth to that. You know, there are dangerous aspects to that mythology as well. But I think that it is certainly the case, for better or for worse, that the world watches the United States, and that where the United States goes has a very powerful impact on both leaders of other nations and their populations. And when has there been a gap between what we say and what we do many times in the past? Yes, but it probably, I mean, if you say that, you know, hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue, even our more hypocritical moments, it matters that we're paying homage to virtue. And I think for most of the last 4 years, we didn't even bother. You know, we stopped. We were just like, Vice, you're good. And we saw that, obviously. We saw President Trump praising repressive regimes around the world, expressing disinterest or disdain for those who pro-democracy activists, human rights activists, dissidents. And I think that was both a shock to our allies, and it was aid and comfort to repressive regimes around the world. I think it's going to be hard. I mean, here again, I'd love your thoughts on this, Sean. I think that one of the big questions that looms over us right now is, to what extent can the Biden administration say, okay, everybody, we're back, just, you know, forget the last 4 years, sorry about that, you know, let's just pretend it's 2016 and start from there. And I don't think that's possible. I think the Biden administration, at least on some level, acknowledges that it's not possible to simply delete the last 4 years, but damage has been done. And that on top of the fact that obviously for all kinds of reasons, it's a more multipolar world, it's a more complicated world. things just aren't the way they were in 1999 or 2009 for that matter. But it's not clear to me to what extent, if any, the US will quickly or indeed ever be able to regain its put back on its mantle as leader of the free world. And maybe we shouldn't even be trying. I don't know. I mean, I think there are many who would argue that under the guise of leader of free world that we have often done much more damage than good. So maybe it's not such a bad thing if both our allies and our enemies are a little bit more skeptical of US claims. But certainly I think from a sort of selfish nationalistic perspective, it's going to be a lot harder for the US to achieve its goals in the international domain after Donald Trump.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I don't think that the Biden administration coming in and changing the tune, so to speak, necessarily turns everything around. I think about how when, word gets out that US officials over the past year or so have brought pressure to bear on state election officials to change results. I mean, that's the kind of thing that just stays in your mind, I think. And you mentioned, I think, Belarus, that, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus tried last year to pressure election officials into falsifying electoral results. That's what triggered a massive, protest in Belarus. So there's these connections that are out there that I think potentially linger on. And I think you can find a number of these sorts of parallels, when you think about how there was this call in some quarters for the Supreme Court last year to decide the election. And oh, by the way, it's a new Republican majority on the Supreme Court, and that's going to be the way in which, President Trump wins re-election. Well, that sounds a lot like, Evo Morales in Bolivia, or Juan Orlando Hernandez in Ecuador. Both were leaders who, faced with a constitutional provision that barred them from continuing their term in office, basically pressured judges into reinterpreting those provisions so that they could continue in office. So what I worry about is, while thankfully our Supreme Court didn't go in that direction, it feels like the types of discourse that we have seen in recent years, and that to a certain extent will probably continue, because it's not obvious there's just an immediate break right now from what we've seen. It feels like this may well foment authoritarian regimes, in the sense that they say, well, if the US does these things, it's not such a big deal for us to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I feel like we're probably just depressing everybody who's listening to us. Everybody's just gonna go home and cry. So I'm sorry about that.
Well, let's try not to do that. So let's shift it over to what can people do about this? I think you quite nicely earlier on in the conversation noted some of the actions that were taken last year in the lead up to the election that were quite important. But maybe we can talk about this a bit more. What can lawyers do? What can activists do? And what can others do? I'm reminded of the book by Harold Koh from 2018 entitled "The Trump Administration and International Law," where he posited that President Trump was a unique threat to the rule of law. But he also posited, and this was of course based on the first 2 years of the Trump administration, he also posited that the administration was far less successful than people believed it to be, because of a counter strategy essentially unleashed by lawyers and activists and others. So I guess the question for us might be, is there a constellation of international and national lawyers that have the power, have the ability, have the willingness to stand up to these threats to American democracy that we're seeing? What do you think?
I sure hope so. And I, as I said earlier, I think a lot of people did stand up, and it made an enormous difference. It kept things from getting much, much worse. Our echo has returned. Suspicious. I think that so the folks who do research on civil conflict and political violence, one of their most basic findings is that when one or both of the main political parties or political actors come to believe that they cannot win in a sort of fair election, that there's no possible way for them to get back into political power legitimately, that tends to be a precursor of significant civil conflict. And I think that we clearly were, teetering right on the brink of that in this last year or so. And lawyers and courts do play a tremendously important role in saying, no, our system is completely imperfect, yes. And I think from the sort of liberal critique, there are all sorts of democratic deficits, but it's the system we've got at the moment. Much as we might wish to change it, it's the system we've got. And despite those democratic deficits, it does remain possible for either political party to play by the rules of the game and win. And we want to encourage people to play by those rules and not to simply say, this game is no fun anymore. This game is rigged. I'm going to, kick over the game board, which is what came very close to happening. I don't think that saying it is really important to play by these rules requires us to say, because the rules are just and legitimate and should never be changed. I think it just requires us to say, because flawed rules are better than no rules, and we know that, and that's sort of what lawyers do, right? That's sort of what it is to be a lawyer or a judge, is on some level to say, I don't need to like these rules, and in fact, I may be advocating to change these rules, but flawed rules are better than no rules, and there is a value in saying, work with this, folks, and trust this, at least not to be completely rigged. And it's hard because obviously there are societies in which the rules are so rigged that you can't say that. I don't think we're at that point in this society quite. We could get there, but we're not there yet. And I think that walking that tightrope of trying to restore people's faith on both sides of the political spectrum, that we have a system that, although imperfect, is okay, that either party can prevail if it plays by those rules. That's really important, walking that tightrope while at the same time saying, hey, and oh, by the way, Electoral College, we should think about changing that. Oh, by the way, gerrymanders cause all these problems, we should think about changing that. It's a really hard tightrope to walk, but I think it's one we have to try to walk.
I'm reminded in part of the rather remarkable success by Stacey Abrams in Georgia. My wife's from Georgia, so we were following closely, a state that, you wouldn't have predicted would necessarily have quite the turnaround it has had in terms of opening the doors to voting rights and focus on election integrity and things of that sort. But basically under her leadership, a real grassroots effort to make the system better. And it does suggest that lawyers, activists, others can play a role, as hard as it may seem in any given context, can play a role working within a system that, as you say, it's not perfect, but it's a good system. It's a system that can be can be improved.
Yeah, you know, and some of my earliest work earlier in my law professor career was on rule of law issues, and really emphasizing that the rule of law is, you know, it's not a set of institutions, it's not a set of formalistic rules, it's a culture, it's a set of cultural commitments. And I think that these last few years have only, you know, reinforced that, that we can't sit back and say the system will take care of the system, you know, the guardrails will take care of us. That we all have to constantly be saying, the system works when we make it work. How do I help make it work? And that has to be something that goes on forever. You never get to sit down and say, okay, good, we got it. We can relax now. We have to be constantly engaged in that process of simultaneously reaffirming existing norms, and recognizing that there are processes and rules that no longer comport with our ideas of fairness and our ideas of justice. And we have to have both a mechanism to change those, even as we work to reinforce existing norms.
You made an interesting point about how maybe it's not such a bad thing for the US to come down from being the shining city on the hill. And in that regard, I wonder a little bit about whether it might open the door for us to do a bit more comparative constitutional thinking, where we look at other countries, look at maybe some similar problems they've faced, design their or redesign their constitutional system, statutory system, because, you know, there can be a lot to learn from abroad, and maybe we've been a little bit too insular and not looking across the border to see how others have coped with these problems.
Well, I think we have turned our constitutional interpretation into, you know, theology rather than law. And we have been so worshipful of the system laid out by the framers that it's been a barrier to change in many ways. And I think, you know, again, some flawed rules are better than no rules, but we should be able to say, you know what, political science has advanced a little bit since 1787. And it is not automatically the case that the system created by our Constitution that we may think was the best possible compromise at the time, maybe not, right? But even if we think it was, maybe it's not the best possible way to look at this now, right? That things have changed a little bit. There are issues of scale, among other things. That we are a vastly more inclusive society, thank goodness, today than the United States was in 1787 or 1789, and that we do indeed have much to learn, both from scholarship on governance and from the experiences of other countries. And quite a lot of that does indeed tell us that no, our system is not necessarily the best of all possible worlds here. It's such a tricky balance of sort of how do you simultaneously open up that space to say, yeah, we can reconsider some of this. This made sense once, maybe, but it doesn't now, or you know what, actually it really wasn't just even then, and now it sure isn't. While at the same time saying, you know, let's not throw the whole thing out the window and decide it's just a free-for-all and whoever has the most guns wins.
So we have a final question from Peter Kohling about whether we should be thinking about international courts and tribunals, you know, to the extent that our national courts were guardrails of a sort. Should we be looking to international courts to help in this regard? And maybe I'll take a first crack at that, Rose.
Go.
You know, the United States is not embedded in a system of international courts in the same way some other countries are. So we don't have a, you know, European Convention on Human Rights, for example, that we've joined, the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights we haven't joined. We are to a certain extent exposed to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. That might be a place for one to bring a petition, but the US government doesn't view the decisions coming out of the Inter-American Commission as legally binding. International Court of Justice, maybe it's where you'd have an interstate action brought. So you'd have to have some other country coming after the US saying, you know, you violated some international, you know, obligation. And that just seems a little bit unlikely. So because the US isn't especially embedded in the international judicial system, I tend to think this is an unlikely path for us to rely on. What do you think,
Yeah,
Rose?
I think that's right, unfortunately. I think we have a lot of repair work to do in this country before international mechanisms will be more effective. Because so many Americans, American elected officials, ordinary Americans from both political parties are skeptical to hostile of international institutions and rules. I actually thought one really important and good thing that Tony Blinken, our new Secretary of State, did in his first major speech was he really emphasized in his remarks that foreign policy should matter to Americans. It affects all of us, that you cannot draw that sharp distinction between domestic policy and foreign policy. And I think that's the case that we need to continue to make to Americans, that this isn't just some other stuff somewhere else that we can ignore and we should ignore because it's different people, foreign people, which I think is frankly, unfortunately, too many Americans think, but that, hey, we are embedded in the system. We have to care about it because it will affect every single one of us right in our own communities. But it's going to take a lot of time to persuade people of that. And if we get to that point, that is when I think it will become more effective to use those international tools to exert pressure on the United States.
Well, Rosa Brooks, I think we're out of time. This has been a great pleasure for me to have this conversation with you. And although there were a bit of lows in the conversation, I hope that we had enough highs in terms of the hopes for the future that folks don't get too discouraged. It was a real pleasure, Rosa. And if anyone watching would like to continue the conversation, just click the button on your screen to continue conversation, and Rosa and I will see you in the next phase.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Take care.
Bye-bye.